This morning is Stephan Livera. Stephan hosts a podcast, the Stephan Livera podcast. So it should be relatively easy to remember. And if you like what he talks about, he's going to be explaining Bitcoin and the fundamentals of it. I do recommend a specific talk on his podcast, which was with a person called Plan B. It was really, I thought, interesting. It talks about some similar methods that you would measure gold to Bitcoin as well. Thanks, Stephan.
Thanks very much, James. All right, hi everyone. So I'm Stephan Livera. I'm going to be speaking a little bit about Bitcoin and decentralization. Just before I get started, I just want to get a sense of where everyone is at in the room in terms of beginner, intermediate, advanced. So hands up if you would consider yourself Bitcoin beginner in terms of your knowledge. Yeah? Okay, look, most people are beginners. All right, I'll just make sure I keep that in mind when I'm speaking about it. So a couple of things that I'm going to speak about. So who am I? I'm a Bitcoin podcaster, and I host one of the leading Bitcoin podcasts. I also have a focus on Austrian economics. So I host Austrian economics on economists on for discussions as well. So I think the way to think about Bitcoin is to understand why it's decentralized and what makes it special. So one way to conceive of that is there is no CEO of Bitcoin. There is no marketing department of Bitcoin. There is no central bank of Bitcoin. And so consequently, what does that mean? It means that it can't be stabilized in terms of value by some central actor. And that may seem confronting at first, but essentially the view is that over time, it's a longer-term monetization process. And the world is sort of going through these options of what's going to be the new world standard. Is it going to be gold? Is it going to be US dollar? Or is it going to be Bitcoin? And we believe that because of Bitcoin's decentralization, it has certain characteristics around it that achieve things that were just simply not possible with human institutions. What do I mean by institutions? I mean things like the rules of the game, the courts, the judges, the laws that are written, the way that property rights are allocated or protected in the world, that we can think of Bitcoin as this monetary defensive technology, if you will, or value defensive technology. And it allows a sort of asymmetric cost, if you will. So it's because it allows people to cheaply defend their value in some ways, or be able to defend their ability to transact freely, while imposing a very high cost on an attacker to try and either steal your Bitcoins or to censor your payments of Bitcoins, whether you want to send Bitcoins internationally or to the person next door or whatever. So there's a few things to think about with that. So I'm going to assume there's going to be a lot of questions, so I'll keep my part of the presentation relatively short and allow time for questions. So make sure you come up with some questions. I'll be happy to answer those. So speaking to Bitcoin's decentralization, we have to understand the different players in the ecosystem, if you will. So I'm going to just go through at a high level who do I mean when I'm speaking to those parties there. So at the top, developers. So you've got developers who are working on Bitcoin at a protocol level. That means, I'm just trying to put that into terms that make sense. In the same way that you would interact with email using, say, Gmail or some other program, actually underlying that is this thing called SMTP. And that is like an underlying protocol or rules of the game for email. And so you can think of it like when you are using a Bitcoin wallet software, that interacts with the Bitcoin protocol layer, which is sort of sitting at a level below that. Now, what keeps Bitcoin decentralized in that sense is around the development and the coding of Bitcoin at a protocol level, and then the application level of how people use, say, a Bitcoin wallet to interact with that. The miners, so I'm sure you've all heard about Bitcoin mining. Essentially, Bitcoin miners help to secure the network against an external attack. And I'll get into a little bit more detail around that, but that, I'm sure you've heard of mining. So exchanges, so they're typically where you can go to buy Bitcoin or sell Bitcoin. So there are some in Australia, there are many all around the world. Then merchants. So these are people who are accepting Bitcoin for payments. So they can be physical, in person. There are people who are like at a farmer's market will accept Bitcoin for meat or whatever they're selling. And then you've also got online stores who are taking Bitcoin. And one good example in that case is that people are able to set up an online store and accept payment for Bitcoin where they have been denied or debanked or, by the typical banks or credit card companies. And again, not throwing shade at those banks and credit card companies, because even them, they in turn live in fear of losing their banking license. And so that's why there's a lot of political pressure that gets applied to those payment processes and companies, whereas Bitcoin can offer a decentralized payment option that is unstoppable in that way. You can't stop someone just taking payment in Bitcoin. So that's a very powerful thing, and that's something that we would argue is actually distinct from anything else in this world. Because if you make a payment with the US dollar, you can think of it like the US dollar is the token, if you will, and then the payment rail might be PayPal or some other system. But ultimately, that payment can be revocable because PayPal can stop you. PayPal can stop that transaction. And ultimately, really what's happening in the background is there's banks who have relationships with each other across the world, and they will settle their transactions across that ledger, and they might do a SWIFT transaction through the SWIFT network, but then ultimately it's all clearing back through a central bank somewhere. And that central bank can just basically change the game on you. So that's why we have to understand Bitcoin as this decentralized thing that nobody can really stop. So imagine, a better way to think about it might be, imagine that if you could just shoot gold over to the other side of the world and nobody could stop you. So that's a more accurate way to think about Bitcoin. And in that sense, it achieves things that we couldn't do with any other technology because it's unstoppable and it can be sent all around the world, right? If you wanted to carry gold around the world, and especially if you wanted to transact larger amounts, that's costly, much more costly than sending a Bitcoin transaction, and it's much more stoppable, right? There are, as I'm sure you know, there are examples where governments have attempted to reclaim their gold, repatriate it, and there have been difficulties with that, or it takes years. So Bitcoin is a different beast altogether, and in that sense, it achieves something that no other human institution could have done. The other important thing to think about is the total supply of Bitcoin. So as you may have heard, Bitcoin has a eventual total supply just under 21 million, and it will never go more than 21 million. And why do we know that? I'll get into a little bit more detail around how that happens, but essentially, think of it like Bitcoin is a distributed consensus network, and in order to change those rules of the game, the participants in that ecosystem have to agree with that change. But then, on the other hand, think about it like if you're a Bitcoin holder and then somebody came to you and said, hey, are you okay if I dilute your supply? You would likely say, no, I didn't sign up for this. I signed up for the vision of Bitcoin with 21 million as the cap, not 30 million, right? And so if somebody tries to change the game, then you can you can opt out of that, right? And so that is one powerful factor of Bitcoin that helps it resist these sorts of changes, which historically other forms of money have always been very politically vulnerable because the king of the land or the government of the land always has that incentive to want to print more because obviously that enables them to use more of society's accumulated resources, and that in some sense is what has funded wars and all these other government programs in a way where the government doesn't have to explicitly tax you, it can simply inflate away. Think of it like they're sipping from the bottom of your milkshake, right? They're constantly sucking away that value at the bottom, whereas Bitcoin represents a defense against that in some ways. So, hodlers, right? So you might have seen on the news this whole meme of hodl and so on. Basically what I'm referring to here is investors in Bitcoin, or speculators in Bitcoin. You could use that term as well. In some sense, it is a speculation on further adoption of Bitcoin because it has certain characteristics that just could not be achieved any other way. And so from a Bitcoiner perspective, we would argue that actually gold had certain vulnerabilities that caused it to be centralized in its storage. So because gold gets stored in centralized vaults, it becomes easier for a government to try to turn up to the vault and seize the gold. But because with Bitcoin, as I was mentioning, it's a more decentralized system. It means that you can secure your Bitcoins in a much more decentralized way. We can even use more advanced technologies known as multi-signature, meaning you can, in some sense, split up the ability to spend that Bitcoin, right? You know, like in the movies, they've got like the guys with the 2 keys to launch the nukes or whatever. You could think of it like that, but you can do a setup where, say, you split up your Bitcoin into, think of it like 5 shards, or you have 5 keys, and you need 3 of those 5 keys to spend. And you could keep 1 key at home, 1 key in a vault, 1 key in a safety deposit box, 1 key with your cousin overseas, another key elsewhere. And in doing so, you are still maintaining control over your ability to spend that Bitcoin, but you're also helping secure it, because it means there's no single point of failure. There's no single point that someone can just come and take your Bitcoin private keys. So let me just zip through it in a little bit more detail. So remember I was talking about developers. Part of what keeps Bitcoin decentralized is this idea that developers can write code, as in that software that you would run if you want to interact with the Bitcoin network, but they can't force you to run it. So a quick example, let's say a developer was malicious. What could they do? Maybe they would try to code up a version of Bitcoin that had 30 million Bitcoins, right? But then if you're a Bitcoin holder, you would say, hold on, I'm not running that software. Why would I run this 30 million Bitcoin? I signed up for the 21 million Bitcoin. Or there might be other characteristics that you disagree with around how Bitcoin works. And this is getting into a little bit more of the technical details around how a transaction on the Bitcoin network is propagated, or how a blockchain, right? What are the rules around the validation of those blocks. So that is one thing that helps keep Bitcoin more decentralized in that sense. In terms of miners, so miners don't determine what Bitcoin is, but understand that miners help secure the Bitcoin network. And in doing so, what they're doing is essentially making it hard for an attacker of the protocol to successfully complete that attack, because it tends to turn their incentive more to actually support the network. So miners do what's known as SHA-256 hashing. They're trying to compute a certain hash under a certain value, and then that enables them to earn a reward. And so the incentive of Bitcoin is essentially that these miners have the incentive to contribute to the security of Bitcoin's network rather than attack it. Now, there's a little bit more nuance that goes into that, but that's sort of the high-level way to understand that. Now, mining centralization, it may have started off in Bitcoin's earlier life, it was more centralized. But then over time, it's become more and more decentralized. It's spreading around the world. There are more people setting up in different locations to do their mining. And so that also helps articulate this idea that Bitcoin's protection, if you will, Bitcoin's security guards, if you will, they live all over the world. Think of it like that. So, the Bitcoin exchanges. Now, the Bitcoin exchanges don't necessarily determine what Bitcoin is. They are also dependent on the speculators and the investors of Bitcoin, the people who want to buy and sell Bitcoin, to make sure that they're correctly transacting on the correct blockchain. So if somebody were to try to change what Bitcoin was, the exchanges wouldn't necessarily be able to just change over to what that is. They would have to figure out, well, hang on, what do the users actually want? So historically, there have been attempts to try and attack Bitcoin. One was known as Bcash, or Bitcoin Cash, right? And this was basically an attempt to try and attack Bitcoin's network. And basically, the exchanges had to list 2 separate tickers. They listed a BCH ticker and a BTC ticker. And historically, there was another attack called the SegWit2x, basically. So another token was being pushed by many of Bitcoin's biggest exchanges and companies. And yet Bitcoin still resisted this attack. How did it do that? Well, part of that was because the hodlers, or the holders, and the people who want to speculate in Bitcoin are saying, no, hold on, I don't regard that as Bitcoin. That's like B2X, that's some other token. What I care about is BTC, Bitcoin. And so this is a bit more of it's a bit more of an esoteric point, but I'll come to it later around the Schelling point idea. So merchants, so similar kind of idea. Again, merchants need to be sort of aligned with what their user wants. So if their user is transacting on Bitcoin, and most of the volume is Bitcoin, not altcoins, then that is essentially the same kind of idea, that it's the users and the crowd who, in some sense, choose what is Bitcoin. And so the holders. So these are very important because what they're doing, and you can see in the background, that is an example of a Bitcoin node. So what that does is essentially verifies the full set of transactions that have ever taken place in Bitcoin, and it allows you to validate in a what we call trust minimized way. You know that you have Bitcoin. You're not trusting somebody else to tell you, oh, hey, Stephan, you've got 1 Bitcoin or whatever. It allows you to basically validate that you have control. That's a kind of a high-level way to think about it. So fundamentally, who controls Bitcoin? It's sort of like the crowd controls Bitcoin, but in doing so, it depends what software they are running on their computer or on their node hardware, full node hardware. So that's the point that I'm trying to get to and articulate here, that Bitcoin is decentralized in that way, that there's all these people, thousands of people, tens of thousands of people or more, who are running their own full node around the world and stacking Bitcoins, basically, trying to stack their Bitcoins and then validate them using their own full node. And that's kind of the vision of Bitcoin, and in some sense, that is what helps defend the decentralization of Bitcoin against any other centralizing attack points that may compromise the ledger or compromise the total supply of Bitcoin. So the Schelling point. So the way to think about that is, if you've read Nassim Taleb, he speaks about this idea of a Schelling point. So he's saying, well, imagine you were in New York and you were talking to your friend and you had to communicate, well, you couldn't communicate with them, rather, and you had to try and figure out, okay, where and when are we going to meet tomorrow, but without knowing. So you have to try and guess where he's going to show up without you being able to speak to them. And so, does anyone know the answer? Okay, so the answer Nassim Taleb gives in that is that you would meet at Grand Central Station at 12 noon, right? So there are certain points that everyone just focuses on and goes to that. So in the same way, we can think of Bitcoin like that as well. So it's sort of like all of those different people running different nodes, they are in some sense saying, this is the version of Bitcoin that I believe is Bitcoin. And we sort of converge together on this idea of, oh, it's 21 million with these block rules and these transaction rules that determine what is a valid Bitcoin transaction, what is a valid Bitcoin versus what is invalid Bitcoin. That's like not, so think of it like your full node is like a fake Bitcoin detector. That's one way to think of it. Sorry, fake gold, like a fake gold, like a gold detector. Fake gold detector might be to try and assess, okay, is there tungsten in the middle of this gold? Think of your full node like that. It helps you verify that you really have Bitcoin and someone's not lying to you that, oh, Stephan, I gave you 1 Bitcoin, but actually you verify that on your full node. So that's the vision of Bitcoin. And so that's that point around the Schelling point. So a couple of quick points I want to hit around Bitcoin's history and pedigree, right? So there are some people who say, oh, but what if Bitcoin is the MySpace? Then what if something else is coming and it's going to be the Facebook? I think this is showing an ignorance of Bitcoin's history and pedigree. There's a multi-decade history of cypherpunks who are building towards this vision of Bitcoin as digital cash. What do they mean by cash? They meant something like a final settlement. They meant, I can give it to you and that's it. It's like equity-based. It's not a debt. It's not somebody else's liability. So they were building towards this, right? They were hash cash, B-money, or you can see up there. So really, a better analogy might be language. It might be, if I went up to someone and said, oh, hey, Stephan, what if there's this risk of English being the MySpace? What's the next language? Well, no, it's more like Bitcoin evolves and it updates over time. And so some of these updates can be pushed through, but only with overwhelming agreement amongst the different parties, right? The developers and the miners and the holders who are running a full node, most importantly. So that's that. Now, I want to contrast this with some of the altcoins. Some of the altcoins are very much not decentralized because many of these are effectively a cargo cult. These are people who are trying to take certain components of Bitcoin and then market their own little thing as though it was better, when really they're not telling you about certain security trade-offs that they have made around why or how this altcoin supposedly achieves higher transactions per second, or some other thing that it does, whatever, smart contracting or whatever they'll say. So here, on screen, you can read there, you see that line at 3:43:01, second line from the bottom, Vitalik said, okay, can you guys stop trading? So, what am I referring to here? This is the Ethereum hack. There was an Ethereum hack years ago, and they wanted to roll back the Bitcoin blockchain, the Ethereum blockchain. So they wanted to basically change the rules of the game after the fact. Now, would that be an immutable rule set that everyone can agree on? Well, no, it's now actually controlled by Vitalik and these guys at Consensus. So that's the importance of decentralization and the importance of basically, when you're in this space, you should have a scam-first heuristic. You should be thinking, no, this is a scam, until they've proven to you that it's not a scam. So take that what you will. And so look, some of these altcoins, they've got a controlling foundation. They have a benevolent leader. They will push through what is known as a hard fork regularly. So for example, Ethereum uses this exact mechanism because they've got a foundation and they've got consensus. They have, and I'll get to another example on this. And then, over on the right, you can see Zuko, the guy who founded Zcash. But again, it's founded by a company. It's literally supported by this company that determines what Zcash is. Is that really going to be something that can be taken outside the control of the government? Because the whole point of this game, or the whole point of this thing, was to take money outside the control of any one company or any government. So yeah. So here's a quick tweet from one of my friends, Grubel. So he's saying, look, there's nothing DeFi, decentralized finance, or bankless about connecting your client to a node that's ultimately being run on Amazon Web Services. Because ultimately, you're just trusting this company called Infura within the Ethereum ecosystem. So again, Ethereum is not decentralized. How can these people claim that they're doing anything important when the government could simply go to Amazon and just say, hey, I want you to change the rules of the game? Because remember, Bitcoin is about protecting a certain rule set of these rules of the game, if you will. Now, some altcoins are SEC regulated. So for example, Blockstack. I mean, they'll make this song and dance about, unstoppable applications and so on, but they're SEC regulated. So again, couldn't the SEC just rock up and just, you got to pick one or the other. Are you decentralized or are you SEC qualified? Now, on the point of blockchain technology, I'm going to make this argument of Bitcoin, not blockchain. Why? This is Nick Szabo up here. He's one of the legends within the space. He's written many formative texts and theories. He's a cryptographer and a computer scientist, and also a monetary historian as well. And so what he's saying here is the secret to Bitcoin's success is not its computational efficiency. It's actually about what we call social scalability. This incredible computational cost is the price that we pay for social scalability. So he's talking about this idea like the Dunbar number, right? This idea that we could only interact in villages or small tribes of about 150 people because those were the only meaningful relationships we could have. And if you go above that number, you tend to just have much looser friendships or relationships with these people. And so in that sense, what this is doing is kind of helping us scale beyond that Dunbar number, but keeping the rules of the game protected. Because again, Bitcoin is more decentralized. So I'm going to sort of leave it with that, and I'll allow some time for questions. But if you want to find me online, you can look up the Stephan Livera podcast or Ministry of Nodes, which is our Bitcoin education company, in which we're doing basically an Australian company to do Bitcoin education. And you can find me on Twitter at Stephan Livera. But I'll take time. I've got about 5.5 minutes for questions. So, yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the question is, governments want taxes. How does that fit in with Bitcoin? Now, to answer that, a good question, I would suggest that over time, governments will have to change their method. There will need to be tax reform, essentially. My speculation, I don't have any inside knowledge, but I think the government will move away from things like income taxation and consumption taxation, and it'll just move to things like physical property taxation. It'll start saying, Stephan, you own this land and that land, we'll charge you based on a percentage of that. It'll be like property tax. That's the likely scenario in my view, but again, the broader answer is we will see jurisdictional competition. So we already see some jurisdictions around the world that have no CGT, no capital gains tax. And so obviously that's good for people who hold Bitcoin and so on. Singapore, Switzerland, Portugal, some other examples. Yep.
Currently, the miners are getting incentivized by getting a bit of Bitcoin. What will happen when we hit that 21 million in the next several years?
Great question. So the final amount of Bitcoin will be mined in the year 2140, over 100 years from now. But it's a great question, because so there's two components to the miner reward. One of that is known as the block subsidy, as in the new amount of Bitcoins getting mined, but that's coming down over time, as you know. Then the other component is fees. So there will be a component of when you do a Bitcoin transaction, you're spending fees, you pay fees. So basically that's the short answer, is that over time, it's like right now it's block subsidy mostly and like low fee, and then over time it will shift the other way around such that most of that reward is coming from fees. Yep.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I'm an absolute beginner and I don't understand the difference between, and you may have covered it and I glassed over.
Yeah, go for it.
Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash.
Yep.
What are the differences?
So essentially, Bcash, Bitcoin Cash, was like a malicious fork by one entity, a group of people who believed that Bitcoin should basically scale on-chain. And this comes back to this idea of decentralization, because it's a bit complicated. I can't give like a very quick answer, but I'll try to. Essentially, what they did is they thought all the transactions should just be stored directly on every full node around the world. Whereas the Bitcoin view is more like, no, hold on, there's computer science limitations to how much can be stored on every computer, and because, again, this gets into the computer science and the networking and the distributed systems components of it, is that the network has to maintain consensus. And if you tried to scale naively on-chain, that's just not going to work. Whereas we are more proponents of other technologies, such as Lightning Network and others, that allow you to basically scale beyond that transaction limit, and other ways that maybe we might transact on layers above Bitcoin. So, you know, I might have a retail bank and you might have a retail bank, and we'll transact on that layer rather than directly on the Bitcoin base layer, if that makes sense. Does that help? Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, Stephan. Thank you for the overview. I mean, I would say Bitcoin has many amazing properties, but I think if you're trying to say that Bitcoin's going to make the financial system and laws and companies and government control go away, you're absolutely nuts. And for example, how much Bitcoin can you buy in India? How much usage can you have in China, even though something like 70% of the mining is controlled by 3 big Chinese groups, I believe. So I guess I wonder, my question is, why is there the necessity to posit Bitcoin as this replacement for evil banks, evil governments, evil centralized organizations, when it has so many other benefits, and those kind of anarchistic type antecedents and views of it are completely fanciful?
All right, so a few things there. So firstly, the comment about 3 miners owning 70% of the hash rate, I'm sorry, that's just factually not accurate. There are like at least 8 or there's like at least 8 or 9 big players, and they're just continually decentralizing. To the point around what is Bitcoin about, I think you don't necessarily have to be a libertarian to believe in Bitcoin, to see the value of Bitcoin. What it is taking money, the control of money away from government or from any one company. So, okay, so the comment was they'll never allow it, right? So my response to that on that point would be, we have to consider it more like there's just there's tendencies of convergence towards the best money, right? So as Dr. Wiener was talking about that idea of set marketability, we would suggest that because this is a global world, there's going to be jurisdictional competition, there will be some nations that are anti-Bitcoin and others that are pro-Bitcoin. There will be some that want to accept it, and there will be certain tendencies towards people who would rather hold their money in something that can't be so easily inflated. That's the short answer. And fundamentally, the reason, like, it might sound like, oh, you know, whatever, the government, but ultimately, it's not about the government itself. It's about basically, it's about saying that if you give someone the power, they'll abuse it. So this is an attempt to take it out of any one person's power. That's kind of the short answer to that. I'm out of time, but thanks very much.
Excuse me, Stephen, we've got one.
Oh, okay, sure, yep. I'll be very quick, yep.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I'm a bit of a Bitcoin novice, really, and I'm sort of skeptical, as most people are. I'm just wondering, what's your take on scalability? As if you imagine a pipe, it can only let so much water run through it. So as Bitcoin grows and as it scales up to worldwide, maybe a centralized sort of a currency or a new form of money, what's your take on scalability of that? As how much it can allow, and would that create a backlog of transactions that sit in some sort of a funnel waiting to get processed? And also, what's your take on ultimately store of value in relation to gold?
Okay, so I don't think I've got time to give a good answer on that, but the short answer on scalability is essentially there are technological advancements that are being worked on right now, such as the Lightning Network, that will allow you to basically settle to the Bitcoin blockchain the final balance of a lot of transactions. So basically you're scaling by taking transactions off the chain. The second point around store of value in relation to gold, that's more of a question of what will the world converge on as the best money? And if there are certain rules of the game that we believe that Bitcoin has and certain characteristics that make it a superior money, potentially, in the future, that's sort of the answer. So look, I'm running over time, so I'll leave it there, but thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Maris.